Welcome to the School of Batman, a podcast where we ask academics to help Batman fight crime using their research. I'm your host, Chris George, amateur scientist and professional Batman enthusiast. We thought we'd explore the origin of Batman himself in this special one-shot, The Case of the Unexplained Illness. We're pleased to be joined by Isabella Fuentes, who has a PhD in Neuroscience from the University of Kansas Medical Center. So how did you come to neuroscience, and do you have a particular specialism within that field?
So when I got my bachelor's degree in biochemistry, I thought that I was just gonna work as a tech in a lab, and I was kind of looking around for things to do, and my undergraduate research mentor suggested applying to graduate school, and I sort of did it on a whim. Funny enough, I told myself during that first year of graduate school, as I was trying to decide which lab to join and which field to pursue, that neuroscience was definitely not going to be on that list. I was never going to go into neuroscience. The brain is too complicated. But I ended up choosing 3 different rotations, and each happened to be a neuroscience lab. And I just sort of fell into neuroscience, but when I finally chose a lab, it was with Dr. Julie Christensen. She was a young faculty member, and her focus was on chronic pelvic pain and how early life stress can influence the development of pelvic pain in adulthood. And so we focus a lot on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis as a stress response. And so my project kind of developed out of there, where I focused on early life stress and chronic pelvic pain in a male model.
As someone who's been an enthusiastic layman towards science for years, the emergence of neuroscience in pop science has been something to behold over the last few years. Why do you think it's kind of broken through into that mainstream kind of layman science area in those past few years? Has it been an advent of new technologies, new discoveries, or is it simply things go in cyclical kind of nature?
It could be any one of those things. I think that in the United States in particular, when Barack Obama was president, he began the BRAIN Initiative, which was a really aspirational program. We're trying to increase funding to specifically neuroscience research, but one of the loftier goals, I think, that will probably take a few more years than was originally proposed, but the ability to map every cell in the brain and to sort of map the function of those cells. Because there are a few different types of cells and or neurons, glia, some other types of things that we're not entirely sure how each cell individually causes a reaction or records a sensory experience. We have a great idea from decades of work, but it's still something that is sort of a mystery. And I think mysteries are what drive curiosity in pop culture, especially psychology, as everyone has a personality, everyone has motivations, but what are the underlying neurological, neuroscience sort of answers or causes for those drives is, I think, really interesting to a pop culture point of view.
Amazing. Okay, thanks very much. Now it's probably time for us to dive into your story. So before we start, we ask our guests to choose which Batman actor they would like to represent their Batman in their story. Have you made a choice there?
I have, and I thought about it, but I think Christian Bale is definitely my Batman. Those movies came out right when I was getting into film, and it was just right before the big comic book boom, so Christian Bale's gonna have to be my Batman.
Christian Bale it is. Thanks very much. A young Bruce Wayne is still deep in mourning as his 12th birthday approaches. It's been 4 years since the tragic death of his parents, and to make things worse for the last 6 months, young Bruce's health has been steadily deteriorating. His weight has ballooned, he's suffering from debilitating migraines and intense bladder problems, causing him to go to the little master's room up to 60 times a day. Alfred is beside himself. and using all connections and wealth the Wayne name can muster, they begin a tour of the finest medical institutions of the country in an attempt to find a cure. Nothing materialises until Wayne Manor receives a late-night visit from the mysterious neuroscientist with an unusual proposal. So Isabella, that's our story. Young Master Bruce has a problem. The mysterious neuroscientist who's visiting, I'm guessing in this instance is going to be you. And what is the unusual proposal for Master Bruce's symptoms?
Well, I would suggest starting with some exercise. A big portion of my research was looking into how early life stress, which having your parents murdered and when you're an 11-year-old is a significant early life stress event, how early life stress can influence chronic pelvic pain in adulthood. And usually these sort of symptoms start manifesting around late puberty, early adulthood. And as far as pain disorders and risk behaviors, illness, diabetes, etc., it just sort of kind of kicks off a negative trajectory as far as health outcomes go in adulthood.
Could you explain a little more about the risk behaviour? Because I'm sure, as we're all aware, young Master Bruce will go on to a life of risk, and how would that manifest from a psychological trauma in childhood?
So in early development, as an individual starts to grow and become an adult, there's a lot of pliability in the neurocircuitry in the brain, and the early life experiences kind of lay the foundation for how the body reacts not only to stress, but to different life events, and how to just normally be a body. And so when early life stress is experienced, it can either heighten the output of the stress hormones that can result in altered stress behavior in adulthood. And so this, I think, could potentially lead to adoption of risk behaviors, and probably at a subconscious level. But our research did not specifically look into the contribution of early life stress to risk behaviors. But there has been a well-established link between the experience of adverse childhood events and chronic pelvic pain, migraine, fibromyalgia, other functional pain disorders, as well as depression and anxiety.
So this idea of a physical manifestation of a psychological trauma, the only frame of reference that I can think of for something like that is something like PTSD with soldiers in war who come back and experience kind of physical manifestations of shell shock and things like that. Am I on the right track with this? Is this a form of PTSD that what you're looking at, or is that something completely separate, or is that something outside of your sphere of knowledge?
They're very similar. So I would, on a surface level, when you're just observing these individuals, they will have a lot of the same symptoms, a lot of the same complaints, a lot of the same functional disorders. The difference, though, is more chemical. So if you were to take a blood sample from an individual that is suffering from PTSD, you'll see that they'll have high levels of cortisol, a hormone that is responsible, or that is involved in the stress response. And if you look at an individual, usually women, men it's a little less consistent, but specifically with women, if they had experienced adverse childhood events or early life stress, and you were to take a blood sample from them, they typically have lower thresholds of cortisol. So they're experiencing a traumatic event in their childhood as someone suffering from PTSD experienced a traumatic event in their adulthood. And they have the same phenotype, they have the same outcomes, but when you're looking specifically at stress hormones, they are different. So a PTSD patient would have a hypercortisol, and whereas a individual suffering from early life stress or had suffered early life stress experiences hypocortisol. So it may be that the experience of stress in early life can prime the receptors or prime the body to respond to the stress hormones more sensitively. And so a lower level or lower concentration of stress hormones actually manifest a bigger response that could equal someone that has experienced an adult trauma.
Right. So, are there any other types of physical illness or conditions that you might be aware of that have a purely kind of psychological origin? Because my thinking, which is almost certainly incorrect based on this conversation, is of a kind of brain-body split, where there's that dichotomy between you have mental illness and you have physical illness, and really never the twain shall meet. Is that view kind of changing? Is that just wildly incorrect?
I think it's being better appreciated how your psychological state can strongly influence your physical perception of pain or discomfort. So if you think about anybody you know, maybe yourself, having gone through depression, you feel lethargic. Sometimes you feel aches and pains. Sometimes you feel like you can't get out of bed, or maybe something that wasn't painful, like you stub your toe, is maybe extra painful during your bout of depression. And this is pretty typical, not only of people that have suffered early life stress, but any average person that had a typical childhood. Depression, anxiety, psychological disturbances really do influence how our bodies perceive our environment and how we interpret our physical or sensory experiences. As far as other disorders that may be purely psychological disturbance, nothing particularly comes to mind, but I believe that is because there's this integral link between body and mind that I think that should be better appreciated by more physicians. Not only should they be treating your aches and pains, but maybe they should be asking questions like, have you had any sort of life changes? Have things been difficult? Are you having some depressive feelings or anxiety attacks? Like, these things are so closely linked that I think it should be part of standard care.
So what is the kind of medical world consensus on this at the moment? Are these becoming accepted ideas that are just not being put into application and practice at the moment? Or are they still quite fringe ideas on the physician aspect?
That is a little bit more difficult to say. I would hate to make broad generalizations, but I would say that in research circles, it is becoming more greatly appreciated. I think typically when you go to the doctor and you're suffering from chronic pain that has no specific origin, you don't know like specifically where it's coming, it seems a little diffused, it seems like it's coming from multiple places. Usually at that point, when they've exhausted all of the painkillers, the anti-inflammatories, the physical therapy, and you're still suffering, at that point most physicians just say there's nothing more I can do. And you're sort of kind of left to deal with your pain. And that is devastating for a lot of patients. But there are some people in the field that recognize that there's this connection between the central nervous system and how the body reacts to stress. So there is a researcher, Dr. Dan Claw, who specializes in fibromyalgia research. And so there is some debate as far as like if fibromyalgia really is a sort of functional pain disorder. But his suggestion is that there is a spectrum of fibromyalgia-ness where there is a hypersensitivity globally of an individual. And he thinks of the brain like an amp, like an amplifier for your guitar, and that it's taking signals from the periphery or from your limbs, from your muscles, and kind of cranking that up to 11, to max levels. And so that's why a lot of these patients that suffer from fibromyalgia have this hypersensitivity to simple touch or to muscle pain that other individuals that may not experience.
So one of the things I'm always interested in is how scientists make their kind of leaps of deduction and how they come up with ideas as to how to tackle these seemingly untackleable problems. So the idea of using vigorous cardiovascular exercise to treat this type of condition seems unconnected to an unscientific mind. So how did that come about? Was there a precedent of research that led you to believe this might be suitable? How did it come about in the first place? What actually is going on there?
Yeah, so where these ideas come from, they can come really from anywhere. There's so many stories where you hear of scientists like they were on vacation or it was an accident, and then, like, for example, leaving out some moldy bread and discovering penicillin. So ideas can come from anywhere, but specifically with the exercise paradigm that we investigated, it actually first came from clinical trials from humans. So there have been a few studies using exercise or regular physical activity to investigate whether or not the physical exertion could attenuate the physical manifestations of hypersensitivity or pain. And they found that exercise has been beneficial to reduce the symptoms of depression, anxiety, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, migraine. And so we were interested in understanding if exercise could potentially decrease the physical manifestations of vulvodynia, prostate sensitivity, bladder sensitivity. And we found some interesting things. We saw in our hands that an early life exercise intervention was more beneficial to decrease the pelvic hypersensitivity in the bladder and the prostate, to decrease the neuroimmune response as measured by polymerase chain reaction. We looked specifically at genes associated with inflammation. We also looked at cells called mast cells that are involved in the immune response. So typically mast cells are filled with histamine and tryptase and other pro-inflammatory cytokines that are released when stimulated, say during an allergic reaction. Stress can also increase the infiltration and degranulation of these mast cells, which in our hands we saw that in response to just the early life stress alone, increase the immune cell infiltration into the bladder and the prostate, as well as the meninges covering the brain, the protective tissue layer that covers the brain, that has also been implicated in migraine in humans and in animal models. So we are seeing this significant neuroimmune response to early life stress, and we looked at exercise, seeing if we were able to decrease those levels of inflammation. And it was sort of a mixed bag, I would say. Other groups have had more success with late in life interventions, but we typically are only seeing early life as soon as possible, as soon as an individual is able to exercise or maybe encourage children to stay active, then they will more likely be able to prevent the hypersensitivity that could result from early life stress.
So to summarize, the mysterious neuroscientist visiting Wayne Manor that evening would be recommending a vigorous cardiovascular program, maybe engaging in a series of different martial arts, and hopefully that would enable his symptoms to abate, but also spark him becoming the Batman. And from that start, we've come to an end, and I'd like to thank Isabella Fuentes for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
If you'd like to discuss your research on a future episode, email us at info@figshare.com.